Well, good evening and welcome to the Great Hall at the University of Sydney. My name's Elizabeth Hill. I'm Professor in the discipline of Political Economy here in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and on behalf of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences here at the University of Sydney, and in partnership with the Sydney Morning Herald, I welcome you all very warmly to this very special event at which we're going to celebrate 50 years of Ross Gittins' extraordinary contribution to economic journalism and more broadly to public debate. Tonight, Ross is joined by his wife, Claudia, and his daughter, Catherine. Warm welcome to you. And I'm also wanting to extend a special welcome to the Treasurer of New South Wales, the Honourable Daniel Mookhey, and New South Wales Minister for Finance and Minister for Natural Resources, the Honourable Courtney Houssos. Welcome to you both. Before we begin the proceedings and the celebration proper, I want to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which the University of Sydney stands, and where we meet tonight, the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's upon their ancestral lands that this part of the University of Sydney campus is built. And as we share our knowledge, teaching, learning and research practices within the university, we also pay our respect to the knowledge that's embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of this country. And we particularly want to acknowledge those elders that have passed on and explained their social conditions to their broader society, kind of in the way that we'll hear Ross has done. So we want to acknowledge that ongoing process of knowledge and learning. So our program this evening will include a number of people who are going to share their experiences of time spent with Ross, working with him, learning from him, and enjoying his mentorship. Those of you in the audience, you might also like to share tonight's event with your networks, and to do so, we invite you to use some of the social media's platforms of your choice, and some of those are listed on the screen. So to kick off the celebration, I invite the Treasurer of New South Wales and Member of the Legislative Council, the Honourable Daniel Mookhey, to the lectern to contribute his insights on Ross's career. Thanks so much, Treasurer.
Well, good evening and welcome to all the distinguished guests, civic leaders, business leaders, academic leaders who have gathered here tonight to pay tribute to one of our state's finest citizens and one of our nation's greatest journalists. I too want to begin by acknowledging that we are on the land of the Gadigal and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and pledge my solidarity and the New South Wales Government's solidarity with all First Nations people as we strive to perfect this democracy by ensuring that its privileges are available to all of its citizens. Can I acknowledge the presence of my partner in fiscal responsibility, the New South Wales Minister for Finance, Courtney Houssos, the marvellous leadership team of the Sydney Morning Herald, Bevan Shields, and the newly appointed Executive Editor, Luke McLiven. Congratulations to you. Arguably, your job is worse than mine. The legendary SMH alumni who are here tonight, who have made this paper such a storied institution in our civic life, and of course the subscribers and supporters of the paper who pay for this outstanding and excellent journalism. The Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sydney, Mark Scott, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, Professor Lisa Atkins, Sydney University alumni of Political Economy and Economics and Journalists who are all here tonight, and of course the marvellous events team of the University of Sydney and the members of the Australian Business Economists Groups. Ladies and gentlemen, one and all, I do welcome you to the night of nights for one of our greatest and most loved journalists, the brilliant Ross Gittins. I want to begin by telling you about how I first developed my intellectual crush on Ross. I can still recall being 14 years old and lumbering through the door of my Maryland's home on a Saturday morning, emptying my rugby bag in the laundry and being handed the vacuum cleaner by my mother. These were the chores that I had to complete before I could get my reward, which was enough money to go ahead and buy the Saturday Sydney Morning Herald. Now, those of you who recall the late 1990s would remember that back then the Herald was a thick stack of broadsheet newspaper in those days. And I was initially attracted to the paper because I was watching for years my older brother read it and then taunt me with its wisdom, claiming it as his own. So out of revenge, I decided to make that ritual mine. I, of course, would read it all, but I read Ross Gittins and Alan Ramsey first, without fail. One of them to stoke my instinct for rage, and the other one to stoke my instinct for reason, and I'll leave it to you to judge which is which. Now, of course, I loved reading about Paul Keating and the conflict of the federal parliament, but it was the Gittins columns that described the world they were fighting to change. And even a 14-year-old boy in Marylands could see the world of finance and business through this narration and relying on his words. It read to me like one big adventure, and I was hooked. It made me keen to be a part of it. So, naturally at that age, I was also interested in finding ways to supplement my own allowance above the level that afforded me the Herald. So, armed with this new economic knowledge that Ross had taught me, I decided to start a lawn mowing business in my area. It did not go well. I had indeed identified a market, I had my own source of labour, but it was the first lesson that theory doesn't always play out in practice. It was from Ross's columns that I eventually gleaned that my business suffered from a lack of capital equipment. Namely, I didn't own a lawnmower. Ross made the theory practical and the complex plain. And I know this was now a deliberate choice on his part. In 1978, breaking with convention, the newly minted economics editor Gittins decided the column should be written for the Herald's readers, eschewing language that only a feral abacus could understand. He was warned he would not be taken seriously by the big end of town, but he persisted and won a broader audience without losing the iconocrats, a term I believe he invented. The ability to express complicated ideas plainly is, of course, the mark of a master. He developed a great following amongst students, and he was generous with his time addressing school classes, a habit which continues to this day. Ross had almost a decade at the Herald before I was born, and another one before I found the Saturday column in my hallway. So I am indeed indebted to Milton Cockburn, the former editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, for sharing with me these recollections of Mr. Gittins' early career. Now, though federal politics is generally viewed as the place where big ideas happen, us humble state politicians also every now and then get to make some decisions. And Ross correctly has always taken a keen interest in the New South Wales budget, realising it usually makes a bigger difference to people's everyday lives. He was also correctly, in my view, an admirer of the late Michael Egan and his budget discipline. When Michael resigned, he wrote, "Take the Michael Egan out of Bob Carr and you're not left with much in the way of financial discipline." And just for the record, that's praise for Treasurer Egan. It's not criticism of Premier Carr. Ross valued his mentorship by Alan Wood over the decades, and he's mentored more than a dozen economic journalists, several of whom we will hear from tonight. But I want to say this story on behalf of myself and the Finance Minister, Courtney Houssos, who was similarly inspired by Ross in her youth, so much so that she blames Ross for her decision to join the Labor Party. And Ross, we blame you too. But we had to, both of us, had to contain our excitement when Ross came to the lockup that we had for the budget last year, and as we were touring and parading around the top of 52 Martin Place, speaking to many of our finest journalists, it took us a while to realise that Ross was actually there. And when we walked out of the room, I recall saying to the Minister that having Ross Gittins come to your budget lockup is like God coming to mark your homework. His following column was firm but fair, so much so that my mother-in-law, who is herself an avid Ross Gittins fan, was prepared to say in her words, "It seems as though you didn't stuff it up." So I hope to return the favour tonight. As a disciple of the man who once published the Gittins Gospel, I faithfully had the New South Wales Treasury look into the major economic events in Australia over the past 50 years, and I can report the following. In 1974, when Ross began preaching in broadsheet to both economic clergy and lay people, inflation was high and growth was weak. TVs were still black and white, but budgets were definitely red. A stint in Canberra saw him witness Australia's 1975 constitutional crisis. He saw the dollar pegged, then floated. He saw tariffs fall and our economy open up. He cheered on reform, but always urged politicians to do more or sometimes less. He despaired when economocrats dreamed up schemes that made sense in theory, but wreaked havoc on the lives of ordinary people. Politicians of all stripes admire and fear him. We can only hope to do our job as well as he's done his. He's been a thinker, an explainer, an educator, an advocate, and above all, a diligent reporter of the Economics Times, loved and lived by several generations. He well and truly deserves to be honoured here tonight. There really won't be another like him. He has been brilliant and has been for 50 years. So may we enjoy many more. Ross Gittins, we salute you. We thank you for your public service. We look forward to your ongoing contributions to the public debate.
Thank you, Treasurer, for that fantastic telling of the story. And we know that we're in a room full of nerds when the budget lockup is the high point of the speech, and the excitement level just grows towards that. So an unusual event we're having tonight, but a completely fitting one, given who we're celebrating. So thank you again, Treasurer. So spanning 5 decades, Ross has seen 11 Prime Ministers, 16 Treasurers come and go. He's written 3 columns a week for more than 40 years. And in those columns, he's analysed and explained those sweeping changes the Treasurer referred to in the Australian economy and also in our broader public life. In recognition of this remarkable body of work, Ross received, here in this great hall, in 2012, an honorary degree of Doctor of Science in Economics from the University of Sydney. So to just hear a little bit more about the 5 decades that Ross has overseen, we've invited 5 people to speak to each one of these decades and share their recollections of the economic stories that marked that decade. So let's begin with 1974 to 1984 with Ian Cassie.
I may fudge the dates a little bit at the start of that decade. If you were going to have a 50-year career in economics and public advocacy, you probably couldn't choose a better starting point than Ross did. In 1974, or the early 70s, Australia was waking from a long economic and social stagnation. On the social side, Australia started the decade with homosexuality a criminal offence everywhere in the country. Women by law paid 30% less than men for identical jobs, and racial and even sectarian bigotry were quite widespread. Until the 70s mining boom created professional shortages, pucker accounting and law firms didn't even like to hire Catholics, let alone salvos. I don't know what they made of Ross. The economy was closed. With a fixed exchange rate, uncompetitive businesses went to the tariff board, which would protect them with tariffs. So there's no reason for businesses to bother trying to be competitive, let alone efficient. That changed when tariffs were cut across the board by 25%. While the 80s are thought of as the big decade of reform, I'd suggest that that first step of exposing the economy to the winds of change set the scene for everything that was to follow. In fact, they made it more or less inevitable. Of course, there were also difficult economic times, as the Treasurer referred to. Soaring oil prices led to soaring inflation, a lax budget, and at long last, lifting women's wages to match men's all added fuel to the inflation fire. But Ross was there to educate the public and goad or support policymakers. And how did that goading and support work? Well, that former enemy of competitiveness, the old Tariff Board, starting in 1974, it eventually morphed into its opposite, the Productivity Commission. And to this day, Ross supports and spreads its wiser words. Thank you.
And to move to the 1984 to 1994, we're going to hear from Clancy Yates.
Hi. The 1980s was a period of sweeping economic change in Australia, as Ian just said. And while I was too young to take this in at the time, it still often comes up in the media as this golden age of reform. As well as the float of the dollar in 1983, Treasurer Paul Keating ushered in huge changes such as deregulating the banks, cutting tariffs, and then in the early 90s, setting up the privatisation of these big government-owned businesses such as the Commonwealth Bank and Qantas. There were also major changes in industrial relations as we moved to enterprise bargaining, and then of course this period also included the severe recession of the early 1990s. I think this decade illustrates a couple of points about Ross's approach. On the one hand, as we've heard, he was a great supporter of moves to deregulate the economy and expose it to more competition from overseas. Even though these policies were tough on some industries, Ross argued that they would help make the economy more efficient, and he also said that they'd help to keep inflation under control. Ross has repeatedly described Paul Keating as easily his favourite treasurer. But you can also see how, since then, Ross's thinking has evolved in some ways. In particular, he's had second thoughts about some of the privatisations, especially monopoly infrastructure being sold off by state governments. And I think it's a sign of how Ross has been prepared to sort of go against the conventional wisdom and become more critical of some aspects of free market sort of economic rationalism, because in some industries, such as electricity or airports, privatisation just hasn't really delivered for the consumer, and that's what Ross is all about. Thanks.
And to move us from one century to the next, I invite Matt Wade to comment from 1994 to 2004.
Ross hired me during the third decade of his time with the Herald. He started in economics journalism during the Whitlam government. It was like a few months or a year or so before the dismissal occurred. I began in the relaxed and comfortable Howard years. It took years before I even covered a government change, either state or federal, let alone a recession. But Australia was in the midst of this record-breaking uninterrupted economic growth run. However, there was one big reform, the GST. It was a topic right in the Gittins wheelhouse. As usual, his columns focused on readers, explaining the complex debates around a consumption tax and evaluating the conflicting claims. But for me, the GST debate draws to attention two things about Ross's work. The first is his abiding interest in fiscal policy, otherwise known to most people as the budget, which includes taxation, the GST and so forth. Ross has covered an astonishing 50 budgets, starting with Bill Hayden's first and only economic statement in 1975, and many more state budgets along the way. I'm sure Ross's interest in budgets is due, at least in part, to his training as an accountant. Second, Ross's view of the GST reminds us of his thinking about governments, and especially the need to fund them properly. Sure, Ross covered the efficiency arguments about introducing the GST, but the big reason he supported it was that it promised a more reliable stream of funding that would make governments better. And there was a chance even that might make society better. And that's something Ross has always been on about. Thank you.
And moving from 2004 to 2014, I invite Jess Irvine.
I was lucky enough to join the Herald as a cadet in 2005 under Ross's careful tutelage. The juggernaut of Kevin 07 arrived soon after, and a special 2020 summit, if you remember that one, was convened in Canberra to map out a vision for what we may now regard as the increasingly distant past. Its main recommendation was for a landmark tax review to be overseen by then Treasury Secretary Ken Henry. That review spawned the great mining tax debate at a time when Australians were also furiously debating Labor's carbon tax. Just don't call it a carbon tax around Ross, which I once did and I got pulled up short. Ross argued passionately for a market price signal to be put on the devastating impact of carbon pollution on our environment. A global financial storm, of course, would also engulf the Australian economy during this era, spawned by the dubious subprime lending practices in the United States. Rudd would unleash stimulus package after stimulus package, sending the federal budget deep into the red. Ross, from his pride of place in the journalist's federal budget lockup, was doggedly on the case as successive governments used all manner of accounting trickery to try and cook the books back into surplus. Not on Gittins' watch, mate. Ultimately, the GFC gave way to what economists would come to call an era of secular stagnation and a growing consensus that interest rates and inflation would definitely have to stay lower for much longer. Congratulations, Ross, and thank you for everything. I've been proud to call you a mentor, and I'm so pleased to be able to call you my friend. Thank you.
And to bring us to the here and now, Millie Morroy. Thanks, Millie.
So at the beginning of this decade in 2014, I was in year 9 and learning about economics for the first time. Ross, meanwhile, was marking Joe Hockey's first budgetary exam. From what I found in the archives, he gave Hockey a distinction on macroeconomic management, a credit on microeconomic reform, and a fail on fairness. By the time I started studying economics at uni, we'd had 3 different prime ministers in 3 years, and just a couple of years later, in 2020, a force even bigger than Ross himself hit the world. The pandemic, along with the economic challenges over the past few years, including inflation, and thinking about how interest rates are used to combat inflation, have made Ross's insights all the more important to help us make sense of the world. He's written about everything from stage 3 tax cuts to cost of living pressures and the importance of looking after our environment. Since I joined the Herald 2 years ago, Ross has continued to read through the spin of government budgets, hold leaders to account, and interrogate the conventional economic wisdom with the added task of catching me up on all the news that I've missed in the decades leading up to now. Ross's legacy is more than the economic, political, and social change that he's witnessed and broken down for readers across the years. It's also his commitment to mentoring journalists, helping HSC students pass their exams, and making the future brighter than the decades that have passed.
Thank you. So, Ross, with that long drum roll, it's now time to hear from you, the person we are here tonight to celebrate and to honour. It is my great pleasure to welcome economics journalist for the Sydney Morning Herald, Mr. Ross Gittins, AM.
Well, I want to thank you for coming here tonight. We've gathered you here to make an important announcement, and it's fallen to me to give you the news of an exciting development. I want to thank Treasurer Daniel Mookhey and Finance Minister Courtney Houssos for being present to recognise the significance of this occasion, by which I mean the announcement that I'm about to make. As many of you know, Mark Scott's illustrious career before becoming Vice-Chancellor, which included running radio station networks and education departments, began with him being an editorial executive at the Sydney Morning Herald. What you may not know is that Professor Scott's Chief of Staff, Darren Goodsir, is a former Editor-in-Chief of the Sydney Morning Herald. And this explains why Peter Costello has asked me to announce that from tonight, the University of Sydney has become the Sydney Morning Herald's wholly owned subsidiary. Unfortunately, Peter has also asked me to break the news that, apart from Mark and himself, none of the rest of us will be getting a pay rise in consequence of the takeover. Now, that may seem fanciful to you, but it's the best explanation I can come up with of why all of you are gathered here tonight in this awesome building to celebrate that some old journo who should have retired a decade ago is still staggering on. Now, I'm too old to suffer from imposter syndrome like my young friend Millie Morroy, but the thought has occurred to me that had the university's officials taken a look at my academic transcript at Newcastle University and seen how much trouble I had persuading that uni to give me a pass degree, we'd be holding this gathering down at Ralph's Cafe in the women's gym. The women's gym of which I'm very familiar since I was made an honorary woman and allowed to use the women's gym. The truth is that I had a lot of trouble passing a subject called economics, which I couldn't make any sense of, perhaps because it didn't interest me greatly. I failed a subject called international economics, but since it was the last subject I had to go, my lecturer was prevailed upon to give me a conceded pass. And that allows me to tell you that I am a graduate. So I have to tell you that I'm a bit bemused by a university of all institutions making such a fuss about me and my job. I've spent much of my time urging the people who I've helped to hire and train as economic journalists not to write like an academic. Keep it simple, I'd say. Don't try to impress people with big words, I'd say. Try to be understood, not to mystify. Now, obviously, that's not the right advice to be giving an academic. A former chairman of the US Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, once famously said after a speech that he'd given, "I know that you believe you understand what you think I said, but I'm not sure you realise that what you heard is not what I meant." Now that is a good thing for academics to say. And though I'm happy to be known as someone who, being a graduate of Newcastle Uni, came from the wrong side of the academic tracks, the truth is that some years ago, in this very building, I was handed a piece of paper so I could claim to be an alumnus of this grand establishment. You guys really should check people's academic record before you hand those things out. Or you should check with my daughter. She's so smart, she has a real PhD, and she'll tell you what she's often told me. Even 4 phony ones doesn't equal a real one. Why, I've even had some misguided fool make me a fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences. Well, all you academics need to meet Alan Greenspan. If you thought what I wrote made sense, you must have misunderstood me. In my job, I'm paid to have an opinion on everything, and I'm paid to give free advice to everyone from the Prime Minister down. I'm now so much older than my boss, I'm allowed to give him, and sometimes her, free advice. She or he, of course, is paid to pretend that she greatly values my advice. So while I'm here in this hallowed hall of learning, let me give the academics 2 bits of free advice. Some years ago, the federal government's chief scientist paid good money to get one of those now infamous 4 firms of accountants turned consultants to fudge up a dollar figure for the value of science to the economy. One of my proteges, filling in for me while I was on holidays, as they do, Gareth Hutchins, these days a columnist at the ABC, wrote a piece saying the chief scientist had to be kidding. Anyone who wasn't smart enough to know that our material prosperity was built on technological advance and that technological advance rested on a bed of pure science wasn't someone who'd be impressed by any magic number. Gareth was right, of course. The point is, academics should never yield to intimidation by those who can see no further than immediate income. Academics must never be ashamed to proclaim their belief in the value of knowledge for its own sake. Knowledge doesn't have to have a monetary value to be valuable. Humans are an inquisitive species. We'd like to know whether the universe is expanding for no better reason than we'd like to know. And thanks to the material prosperity science has brought us, we can afford to pay some scientists to find out for us. My second bit of free advice is that universities should never be ashamed of their preoccupation with theory rather than practice. Every profession needs its theory. We develop theories to make some order, some meaning out of the seeming chaos we see around us. It was long after I graduated that I realised that people in a particular profession spend a few years of their life studying the theory that goes with that occupation before they spend the rest of their working lives using that theory to guide their practice of that occupation. So being given a good understanding of the theory of their profession before they go out to practice that profession is vitally important to their subsequent success. Theory is very important. Now, if you look at what I write about about the economy, I think you'll find that I write about economic theory a lot more than other economic commentators do. Why? Because I think theory is important. Academic economists will complain that I'm often very critical of economic theory. Why? because I think theory is important. The great sin in academic economics is to stop seeking the truth because you think you've already found it. I want to talk now about the little discussed paradox of the commercial news media, and who better than an economics editor to talk about the paradox of the commercial news media. On one hand, most news outlets are in the business of selling their news to make a profit, just like all other businesses. On the other hand, the commercial news media play a vital role in our democracy, informing citizens about the actions of governments and holding governments to account. We rarely think about this paradox, but the truth is, it was ever thus. We had newspapers before we had democracy. Today we talk about public interest journalism, but I like to think of it as the commercial media's higher purpose. Making enough profit to keep our shareholders happy is the obvious part, but we must keep our eyes focused on the more important part, our self-appointed duty to ensure our readers are kept fully informed about all the things our governments are doing and not doing. There's an old saying in journalism, news is anything someone somewhere doesn't want you to know. Governments have a lot of things they do want the public to know about what they're doing. And their spin doctors are always trying to induce the news media to help them get the news out to the voters. Governments have a near monopoly on news about their own doings. When they want something known, they can just put out a press release. Or maybe a better idea would be for me to leak to you something exclusively, provided, of course, that you give it a lot of prominence and provided you run it uncritically. Why would the media agree to such a restriction on their freedom to fully inform their readers? Because if I play along today, you might give me another leak tomorrow. And that will make me look a lot more successful than my competitors. Small problem. What about the reader? Is this the way to keep them fully informed and ensure they're never misinformed? What if I'm so busy trying to be the best at extracting from the government news the government wants our readers to know about, that I neglect my duty to dig out all the news governments don't want our readers to know about? Now, let me be clear. In saying this critical stuff, I don't want you thinking that I'm having a go at my own masthead. I'm giving my free advice to all mastheads. The mastheads formerly known as Fairfax aren't perfect. No one knows that better than I do. But there are other outlets that have strayed a lot further from perfection than we have. Naturally, I won't name those other Australian news outlets. I'm glad you got that one. The digital revolution has hugely changed the news media. Once I'm retired, and here I'm looking at Milton Cockburn, once I've retired, I'll give in to the thought that it was all much better in my day. But while my day is still the present day, I can see things that are better than they ever were. These days, the mastheads our envious competitors like to dismiss as the 9 newspapers devote more resources to investigative journalism than we ever have. We've cut a lot of things. We haven't cut the money that we're putting into investigative journalism. In fact, I'm sure we're spending more than we used to. Maybe because in the digital world that we now inhabit, generating your own news makes more commercial sense. What I'd add is that we need to make all our ordinary news more investigative, more questioning of the messages that some interest group or another wants us to pass on to our readers. Another thing that's better than it used to be, one close to my heart, is much greater emphasis on explanatory journalism. The internet has hugely increased the blizzard of news that we must fight our way through each day. Our readers don't need more news. They need more help figuring out what on earth it all means. This, of course, is a big part of what I've always seen as my role. With the advent of the internet, social media, the greater scope for the spread of misinformation and disinformation, in case you can never remember, misinformation is things that aren't true. Disinformation is things you know aren't true but are still spreading. And now AI, that's the world that we live in. And it's easy to see all this as a huge threat to what's now called the MSM, the mainstream media, of which the SMH is a prime example. We live in a media world where people are finding it harder and harder to know whose news to believe, who to trust. What I want to say is that for the mainstream media and the quality end of the MSM, all the extra doubt and uncertainty about who to believe is playing into our hands. We are still more trusted by our customers than others, than other less reputable sources of information, provided we retain our readers' trust, work to regain what trust we've lost, and make retaining the trust of our readers our highest priority. I think we'll survive, maybe even prosper, in a world teeming with misinformation. We must never knowingly mislead our readers. We must see quickly correcting any errors we've made inadvertently, not as an admission of failure, but as a badge of honour, proof that we can be trusted. We find out as soon as we realise we've told you something that isn't true, we correct the record. That's not a failure, that's a virtue. This means no more, I'm not sure it's true, but it's a great yarn and the punter's going to love it. We can't have any more stories like that. I know it's not true, but it's a great yarn. Let's go. It means no more dubious stories published to oblige a powerful source, usually a government, and keep it supplying us with exclusives. It means telling our readers what they need to know, not what they want to hear. It means being a good read, the hard way, not the easy way. The easy ways of doing our job are the ones that get us into trouble and that cost us our readers' trust. We've always got to do it the hard way. We've got to be entertaining, but we've got to be entertaining without telling fabulous stories about how the Sydney Morning Herald had taken over Sydney University. I'm confident that if we get the trust right, enough money will follow. And I'm hoping to stay around doing my bit for a few years yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you very much. And for our final remarks of the evening, I'd like to welcome to the stage the University of Sydney's Vice-Chancellor and President, Professor Mark Scott.
Well, thanks, Liz and friends. What a happy evening, what a terrific evening here in the Great Hall. And I want to thank Lisa Atkins, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, for hosting this event tonight. And I also want to thank Bevan Shields, and editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, and Darren Goodser, editor emeritus of the Sydney Morning Herald, for cooking up this idea tonight. And I think it's been wonderful for us all to be here, to gather so many friends and to hear from Ross. In my time at the ABC, we used to talk about the power and role of the public broadcaster to inform, educate and entertain. And I was thinking about those three words in connection to Ross certainly informing us, certainly educating us. I thought about entertaining. I thought he sartorially entertained us for 50 years. And can I say, a tie like that is rarely seen here in the Great Hall of the University of Sydney, Ross, and we're delighted that you wore it. I myself had dealings with Ross when I was an editorial executive at the Sydney Morning Herald for, in Ross's middle period. I remember being sent out of news conference when the Reserve Bank had moved interest rates up or down 25 basis points and being told by the editor to go and tell Ross we need 400 words on that. Going and telling Ross that news conference thought 400 words was a good idea. Being told by Ross that 400 words was not a good idea. That wasn't a story and he wouldn't be writing on it, and having to go back into news conference and tell the editor that Ross had determined that his insight on what he wanted on page 1 of his paper was not sound. I think Ross, as we've heard tonight, his own man, understanding his area so deeply and so well, understanding his readers so deeply and so well, and understanding what a story is so deeply and so well. It was wonderful seeing the alumni who Ross has worked with speak tonight, and I think this was one of the absolute hallmarks of my time at the Sydney Morning Herald. They would be referred to as, in the newsroom, as the children of Git. Those young, smart economics graduates or people at the beginning of their career who Ross thought had particular talent, special talent. He would bring them in, he would mentor them, he would guide them, he'd advocate for their stories, he'd support their careers, and it's wonderful how many are back here tonight. At one stage, when I was editing at Fairfax, I thought, well, Ross isn't going to go on forever, and I tried to recruit someone in, and my pitch to him was, Ross isn't going to go on forever. We need a deputy in place to take over from the day that Ross says goodbye to the role. That was 25 years ago, and the person I tried to recruit is quite senior in New South Wales government now. He often reminds me of the folly of my recruitment and the wisdom of his rejection to my overtures. I I just want to talk briefly about just a couple of other areas that I think are really important when you think of the legacy of Ross's journalism. And the first one is with school students. There isn't a school student studying HSC economics who isn't reading Ross Gittins every week, who isn't citing Ross Gittins in their exam papers. And your role, Ross, in educating the next generation of people about economic choices and economic decision making, not just as far as government operates, but how economics operates in their own lives, has been powerful. And I think it's noteworthy we've got some school students in school uniform here tonight. I know that part of your outreach for economics in your work has been, for so many years, talking to groups of economics students and helping them prepare for their exams. And you've been an indispensable part of the inventory of every economics teacher. And I think there was someone who, there was an economics class when the Herald ran those pages of tribute to you, Ross, truly Swiftian coverage, I thought. As part of the Festival of Ross in the Herald, Catherine told me it's always Festival of Ross at the Gittins household, but there was an economics teacher who said that the crowning achievement of the gift from her Year 12 class was an autographed photograph of Ross Gittins that the students got to present to the teacher, them knowing there'd be nothing more meaningful. I'd add, I think one of the really interesting things about having read Ross over the years is just seeing Ross's thinking develop over time and looking more and more about the way he's helped readers think through about the choices that they make in life. And I think that memorable series you did about an economic lens of happiness and what the research and the evidence shows us are the right decisions we can make in our life and the wrong decisions we can make on our life that set us on a pathway to happiness, and a broad view of what economics and economic decision making and thinking can be like. I think tonight, ladies and gentlemen, you'll agree we heard a really thoughtful and powerful treatise from Ross in defence of quality journalism and investment in journalism. And in an era where at times the news can seem very bleak about the future of journalism, a clarion call that a fixed purpose and a fixed mission on quality and serving the reader and making the investment in journalism is something that's there where there is still hope and there is still opportunity in this cluttered and overwhelming media landscape. And I think apart from the takeover, or as I prefer, merger or reverse takeover that you indicated tonight, Ross, I think there are some real similarities between higher education and journalism. Because where we work each day here at the university and where you work, Ross, expertise is valued. And deep disciplinary understanding and all the work that needs to come so that you can write with authority, whether it's to massive readership at the Sydney Morning Herald or write with authority in a disciplinary area here at the university. It's the work that's done to come to a deep understanding that gives you authority to speak and also creates an environment where others want to hear what you have to say, and the impact of your work goes beyond the walls of the institution out into the world and has a powerful, powerful impact. In this era where truth is contested, the value of expertise is more important than ever, and the loyalty of your readers pay back to you the expertise with which you've shared with them now for half a century. So it's been an extraordinary career, Ross, and I think at the centre of it has been the reader's loyalty to you, paying back what at its core has been your loyalty to the readers. It's been a masterclass for half a century, and we're delighted to share the happiness and enthusiasm and celebration with you tonight. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chancellor. Well, it's been my great privilege to host tonight's proceedings. Many of Ross's proteges, or boys, even though some of them are girls, as he calls them, were honours students in my Department of Political Economy, and it's always been a pleasure, Ross, to be able to point them in your direction, knowing that if they got through your rigorous interview process, including the key question, the trick question, and that was, what is the relationship between the price of a bond and its yield? If you can get that answer right, you've got a chance with Ross. But we knew that those of them, and some of them are here, tonight. If they got through that interview process, they were in for a great career. So thank you. We've heard over and over again tonight that Ross is not only the GOAT of all economic journalists, but he's an incredible mentor. And what more could we hope for our graduates? So tonight has been made possible through a collaboration with the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences and the Herald's leadership team of Bevan Shields, Luke McAveen and Tori Maguire. So thank you to that group for bringing tonight's proceedings to bear. To conclude tonight's official proceedings, a special video has been prepared by the SMH. And at the end of the video, we invite you to stay in your seats to watch the video. And at the end of the video, please leave by the side doors and join Ross, his family, his colleagues, his mentees and friends, and you, the readers, for a cocktail reception. Thank you.
In one word, Ross Gittins is caring.
Insightful.
Obsessive.
I mean, the guy's written 5,000 columns over 50 years, so you're going to have to allow me 2 words, okay? So my description of Ross is unlikely superstar.
When you read a Ross Gittins column, you know that he's clearly thought deeply about the issue.
He gets really interested in a topic and will explore it to the full.
He cares really deeply about what he writes. He always has the reader in mind, making sure that the concepts are explained in the most simple and effective way.
From the Reserve Bank governor to an HSC kid, they all love him and they really acknowledge and appreciate his contribution.
Ross has had a huge impact on my career as a journalist. He hired me. I didn't have any journalism experience at the time. He sort of took me under his wing. In the early days, he'd give you this very high level of attention, going through stories line by line with the red pen, and then also just teaching you a lot about how a newsroom works, often over lunch.
He's been there from the beginning, where he's gone through my copy line by line and made sure that I'm writing in the most effective and clear way possible. And then as I've moved into new roles and new activities like writing columns, he's sort of been there to provide that experience and that support and help to bolster my economics knowledge.
He took me under his wing. He was really generous with his time. He took it upon himself to make sure my economic education was up to scratch, but also shared all his column writing tips of, using your own life, using anecdotes, and really became a good friend.
I started in journalism, ready to learn, and after decades sort of myself working in the newsroom, he's still supportive, he's really loyal as a mentor, and he's become a friend.